Welcome everyone. This is Tender Care of the Challenging Volunteer. I actually got a comment today about that title. Actually, I was told it was one of the best subject matter lines in an email that really caught attention. So Tender Care of the Challenging Volunteer will explain a little bit about that. I'm Kim Fleming, Professional Development and Volunteer Involvement Specialist here in Extension Administration, part of the organizational development team. And I'm here with Sarah Dayton. Hello. We're hoping that you can still hear us. I think you can. Just give us a little shout out if you're there. Thank you for putting in your names into the chat box. If you haven't seen the chat box or haven't used Zoom before, the chat box should be on a menu that's at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes you have to roll your mouse over the bottom of that screen to get the menu. You can click chat to bring that box up and put it in a handy place for you. You, I believe, can also see the participants. So click on participants and bring that box up to look to see who has joined us. We really appreciate it. We've got a nice list here. There may be other people joining in also. So it sounds like people can hear. Great. Lots of hellos and highs. So we have about an hour. We'll try to stick to that. We want to have some interaction, so we'll spend a little time on some things just so that we can hear back from you on some of the things that are going on. We have turned off our camera. We'll be more focused on the slides, and we can click back on if we need to do that. But for now, we'll be watching, and if you need anything or have a question at any time, you can just enter that right into the chat box, and you may write to everyone. That's one of the bullets there, or you could also send it to me, the host, or the panelists, and we'll take a look at your emails. So it does look like we have Master Food Preserver volunteers. We've got all kinds of 4-H volunteers, Master Gardener volunteers, board and committee members, which are very important volunteers in our organization and sometimes not thought of because they are in just a little different world, that elected volunteer world. And as I said, we are recording, so we're going to get started. And Connie Kahn is joining us. Welcome, Connie. She may be chiming in here and there. I'm welcoming her to do that. So we've got a good crew, and we're going to get going. This sounds good. We're recording. Everybody knows how to use the chat, and we're welcoming. This is a participatory webinar, so we encourage that. So I'm going to click on to the next slide. So just wanted to, for a moment, picture CCE volunteers. And as you share, there's lots of different people working with many types of volunteers, youth, adults, 4-H, master gardeners, board and committee members.
Did
I do something with sound?
It says Colleen. Can you guys hear us? We've got one in the chat box. It's saying people can't hear us. Oh, well, how about this?
I might have hit something. Sometimes that happens.
Oh, Mary says she can hear us. So, whoops.
Okay.
You popped away, but you're back. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Once we get rolling, it'll be a little less painless, I promise. There always seems to be something going on with us getting going. Just want to talk about the volunteers across the state in Cornell Cooperative Extension. We figure we have about 45,000, I think, at the last count. Maybe 20 or so thousand of those are 4-H volunteers. Master Gardeners is the next biggest volunteer program also. So we have all kinds of volunteers, and we really couldn't do our programming without volunteers. They extend the work of the staff. They don't replace staff, but extend the work of the staff. And obviously, it's very important that we have our extension educators and administrative staff who are out there working with the volunteers. It's an important job and doesn't always get recognized that way. So Sarah and I had put this presentation together a couple years ago. It's sort of a launch beyond that basics of volunteers. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. You should be able to do this in the participant list. Raise your hand if you attended the Tuesday, May 30th, Basics of Volunteer Involvement. That's just covering some of those screening issues. We're getting lots of hands there, fantastic. So we won't be covering a lot of detail around there, but we're talking about that next step with volunteers. We've got the volunteers on board, and how do we set up our programs? How do we manage our programs? How do we address conflicts that come up or help to prevent conflicts that come up? So Appreciate those of you who were able to tune in. We did put the recording up, so if you know others who did not attend or if you haven't had a chance, we do want you to make sure you have the basics before we get going. So now a question, as I said, will be, this is audience participation. So we're going to ask you to just make sure you're writing to everyone, that blue bullet with the everyone in it, and ask us what is it we all want. So as we're working with volunteers, did I take your spot?
Mm-mm.
Okay. We want to make sure we're recognizing some common ground. What can we assume we all want? So if you could just put that in the chat box, so you think about it for a minute and drop that in there. What kind of situations, and think about when we're doing maybe programs or summer programs, think about how just some of those needs you might have. I'll give you a minute to put that in. Fantastic, thank you. If you're with a group, feel free to have a little conversation before you type in. We'll give you a minute to do that also. So what kind of things we want as we're thinking about working with volunteers? What's that common ground that everybody really is looking for? All right.
Okay, we'll put it in.
Oh, you're participating. We'll type for you since you can't reach the keyboard. This is great. So absolutely. So I'm seeing 4-H way, 4-H focus for county specific. Oh, I think that's the answer to the other one. So we talked about high quality engaging programming. That's great, Flip. Thank you. From St. Lawrence County. Motivated involvement from volunteers without conflict. Sometimes conflict's an okay thing, but yes, motivated involvement from volunteers is really important. We want successful programs for sure. We want engaging experiences for all. Safety of children, staff, and volunteers is really key. And I'm not sure if Jamie Ferris is joining us. I think he had another appointment. He might be popping on, but he'll be proud to see that one, especially. Volunteers to focus on the groups they are working with, the needs of the groups they're working with. Also following policy, addressing challenges directly right there on the scene. Very good, thank you. And then leveraging talent. Oh, Connie sharing, leveraging talent. I thought you were saying leveraging talent from Connie. Wow.
We'd like to leverage Connie's talent. So.
And we can't agree with you more. These are really great ideas. So we do want to think about that common ground as you're working with your volunteers and your staff. Make sure you've got a good list going there. Oops, there we go. We put a few things down too as we were thinking about core principles, and some of the things that we want that are also on your list are those empowered staff. We really want staff to be informed, to feel like they can make those decisions, to be ready to act on the spot, especially in those critical or challenging times when there might be that conflict that we don't necessarily want to see. We want to address challenges at the lowest level possible, keep as confidential as possible, so keeping within the group if you can, address it right there on the spot. Keep calls from going to the president was the other thought we were thinking as we put this slide together, right? Or the director even. Address challenges directly, so don't let things get bigger than they need to get. Again, that's that addressing things on the spot, preventing the ongoing stress of staff and other volunteers if a challenge isn't addressed. So that's really important to address the challenges directly. And then keeping the communication very relationship oriented and human centered. And this is one that I really feel like we do quite well, but at times, when there's a volunteer who might be a challenge, or even a staff member might be a challenge, we might tend to objectify them, and we have to be careful about that, always remembering that we're working with humans and to be respectful as possible. we're representing the organization, but we're also working with human people. So let's be sure that we're making everything relationship oriented. We really do want to preserve what we can out of any conflict, especially if there's going to be a continued working relationship. And even if there's not, there's going to be that time where we do have to dismiss a volunteer. Keeping that relationship oriented is very important. Following policy and procedures, I noticed Chuck Brooks wrote that in there, and appreciate that, because we definitely want to reduce the risk and the conflict. So to set everybody up for that success, and then recognizing when things go well. So reinforcing positive behavior and celebrating success. We like to do that here, and I think we like to do that all around the state. So be sure and do that. Anything to add to that? It looks like we got another note in. There we go. Celebrating success, remembering thank you of volunteers is vital for the vibrancy and volunteer commitment following proper communication channel. So yes, let's be sure that when things are going well, we do spend time celebrating that. Okay, on to Sarah.
So when Kim and when I first started here, I remember how much time I was like, Kim, why do you spend all your time on volunteer stuff? Like, they're volunteering. This should just be very smooth and easy. And I think Kim sort of chuckled and just said, oh, you know, there are about 40,000 of them, so it's a big job. And over the years that I've worked with Kim, I've really gotten to see the impact of volunteers, and also the challenge of working with volunteers, and the challenge meaning the amount of time and effort it takes for everyone. So in the work that Kim and I did together, sort of our discussions came up with really sort of how to set up ourselves for success, a successful time with volunteers, managing for success, transitioning for success, and evaluating for success. So the idea is for the workshop today is to explore how to be really best equipped to address the types of things that can come up, and make sure that we're well prepared for it, and that we're prepared to handle whatever the needs of the participants or the volunteers working with them might be, so that we're set for that success. But also the reality is, with 40,000 people and hundreds of thousands of participants, things go wrong. They just do. It's a normal course of events. And so how can we be best prepared for those types of situations? So, of course, as I said, I came into this quite naive and said, why do we spend all this time with volunteers and working on volunteers? And as I said, Kim just chuckled. So the question to all of you is what percentage of your time, and should we say in an ideal world versus sometimes the real world that we live in an ideal world, what percentage of your time would you say should go towards setting up for success versus all the other aspects of managing and transitioning and evaluating for success? So in the same thing in the chat box, what would you say?
And Connie, you can yell out loud if you'd like to, since you don't have a chat box in front of you.
Or you can give it to
Put
me
it on paper again.
Yeah. So we'll give you a little minute. How much of your time do you think should be spent on setting up for success versus the other aspects?
So C is up to 80%, B is up to 40. We've got a 40.
Oh, you're so good, because I can't see the letters.
I have it up close to me. Mm-hmm. We've got another 40.
Mm-hmm. A bunch. Lay a solid foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
All right, great.
Yeah, and I do think, I do think that there's a range. It certainly depends on things like the types of programs you run, the types of if you're working with youth and animals versus adults, all those things have an impact. Whether you're really, really early in your career and your experience with volunteers, whether there's a really well-established volunteer program. If it's a newer program in your county, you might be spending a tremendous amount of time. And it depends on the self-motivation of your volunteers and their abilities. So all of those things can have an impact, but it's oftentimes way more than you might initially think coming in from the outside. I'll say that for myself. I thought, wow, this seems like a really big investment. And certainly Kim and the system have taught me that no volunteers, they're so important and critical to the organization, but it's not just something that happens by itself. It does take quite a bit of investment. Did you want to add anything to that, Kim? You have more experience than I do here.
Nope, I think that's good. I guess what I would add is anyone who is working with volunteers, after they spend a few months doing this, they realize the value of that. And our experienced executive directors, and even if they're just working with boards and maybe don't have a lot of experience with other volunteers, know that they have to commit that time and commit the time for the staff to really set up for that success.
Yep. Great.
Okay. So before we get into some of the other, as we're talking about some of the challenges that might be coming up, just want to talk about what volunteers bring. So we really value the diversity of perspectives that a volunteer might bring to a staff that's in an association or working statewide even. We're definitely talking about a desire, those volunteers are bringing the desire to help people, and that really makes a difference in our program. They're also very enthusiastic and passionate should be one of the words that's on this. I'm not sure why it's not. We get lots of different personalities, and that means that they can easily, volunteers are able to work with a variety of personalities in our participants, if they're teaching workshops or if they're helping out an event, or even if they're in the office. But there's all kinds of ways volunteers might be able to relate. Sometimes because there's more volunteers, more personalities, more diversity, they might relate better to our participants. So we really value everything that volunteers bring. They're sometimes coming in with expertise that staff don't have, that staff go out and look for and recruit these volunteers. So many, many things positive about what volunteers bring to the organization, as well as the ability to influence and have input on the programs that best may appeal to those in our in our counties. So lots of great things, but sometimes despite the best efforts, we do have some challenges. So we may, sometimes that passion might cause a conflict. Passion might cause a challenge that comes up, and as Sarah said, when you start dealing with 40,000 people across the state, we're bound to have some of that. So that's what we want to talk about is maybe ways to work with volunteers if there's they have challenges or dissatisfactions, to work along with them, talk with them, so that we can help to share some tender care and help with those challenges. So we'll move along. One way to set up for success, I know many of you, and if you'd like to raise your hand, that would be great, are familiar with the term isoture. We talked about it at the last webinar, and this is something we've worked with through the system. Our volunteer involvement policy for associations is actually set up this way. So we talk about some volunteer programs do the recruiting and then send the volunteers off to do their work. And in Cornell Cooperative Extension, we're sure that we set up for success. We identify the needs we need in that association. We select the best volunteers who match the needs that we need in that association. We have a very thorough selection process, as Connie knows also. Our whole screening program falls under that selection of volunteers. The tracking how we draw volunteers in, the interview process, the reference checks. So very important piece of setting up for success, and then that orientation. We can't say enough about that. We did spend a lot of time at the last webinar talking about the important needs for orientation, and we're actually working on some other pieces that are coming statewide, getting a few more people involved with that, so we can offer some more resources around orienting volunteers to Cornell Cooperative Extension. So this webinar will talk a little bit more about utilizing those talents, making sure we have that ongoing communication. We've talked about recognizing being such an important part of that cycle, and also evaluating how are things going and talking to volunteers, getting that feedback, having those annual reviews. And the clip on the screen is from the program development reporting tool, and you all know that on the business systems. And this is the volunteer enrollment tool. So here's a way to keep track of volunteers. You can track their gender, their race, their ethnicity, you have your contact information. Even with the casual volunteers, we want to be sure we have all of that, contact information, emergency contact, when they started. So there's lots of different information we can track, and also whether they've been screened or not, and if they're still active. Anything to add there, Sarah?
No, just it is important to capture that race, gender, ethnicity data. As you likely have seen, we have a civil rights audit coming up for the 4-H program right now. And so when we do enroll people, to capture that data, and we can always go back later and add that data in. It can be based on the educator's best guess. That's perfectly acceptable, for us to maintain that data for the system.
And Connie?
Who have access to this information?
The only people that should have this information would be the association for its own volunteers, and that information should only be used to promote other programs. So sometimes we'll have a situation where like a local business might say, oh, I'd love to reach out to all the youth that you come into contact with. Can you share your mailing list? And we always say we should not be doing that. That's a protected list. And sometimes we'll say if that business would like access, they can send their message to us and we can forward it to our list. But the purpose of it is really an internal use to reach out to individuals to invite them to our programs.
And so each association can only see their own, or if they're 2 associations, they can see that.
Yeah.
A question here that came in, I don't know if you can see it there. Is it necessary for 4-H program staff to use the business systems tool to track volunteers when we already have the 4-H online program? So if you only have 4-H volunteers in your program and you're working with 4-H online and you're entering the gender, race, ethnicity, that's perfectly fine, but that does not capture your other volunteers. So boards, committee members, master gardeners should really all go, master preservers. Did I say that right? That sounds
You're
right.
all good.
Yep. So your other volunteers should be in here, and actually we've got a way to bring in input, upload information from 4-H line into this volunteer enrollment tool that's in program development reporting.
Yeah, and as I just mentioned, there is an upcoming civil rights audit. Realize that will focus on the 4-H program. So if you have your information in the 4-H system, that's what the audit will be looking at. As far as we know, we'll find out next week specifically what they're looking for.
Very, very important stuff here. Okay. Oops. Having challenges. Okay, and so we've got lots of tools. You've got support here in Extension Administration. We have wonderful volunteers, and we'd say 98% of those volunteers are really huge support to all of us, and wonderful expert staff. So you have colleagues to talk to in your own associations, across associations, within your own programs. So there is support out there. So remember that as you're setting up for success. Okay, so continuing, here's where setting up kind of leads into managing for success. So when we're talking about in the moment, so we want to get ready, we want to prepare, we definitely want to be sure these are some of those core principles that we had talked about earlier. We want to start with setting up to reduce the likelihood of a challenge, so definitely including that orientation that we talked about as part of ISACHR. We all know how to respond in the moment. Do we have enough staff? Are the volunteers feeling overburdened? We want to be sure we have enough people to run a successful event, and one staff member or one volunteer isn't trying to do everything and can't do anything well. So be careful about that, and also make sure that we're clarifying roles of volunteers and staff. What are the staff going to do? What are each individual volunteer responsible for? So that's where that orientation comes in, so important. And also, what if something does come up? Do we have a point person? So let's be sure we have a point person really to handle any challenge that's on the spot. And let's expect that something's going to happen and be set up that way. Do others know that there's a point person? Be sure all the volunteers know that, all the participants know that, and what do we do in case of emergency? So I know many of the associations have a nice list of who to call first, what to do first. We've had several webinars on that, but we want to be sure that we're handling emergencies consistently and really think through beforehand what happens if there is. Did you want to add something there?
Well, I would say, so remember back when I didn't know why we had to spend so much time on volunteers, and Kim chuckled. So one of the things I do is sometimes manage when things go wrong, and I am support to the associations and the executive directors. And I will say for me, in the experiences where I've been involved in providing help, it tends to be that role clarity. People weren't fully aware of what their role was, or there was maybe a misunderstanding between a couple people about who was supposed to do what, and those tend to cause conflicts. The other place where we've had some challenges is the go-to person, and not everybody knew who they were supposed to go to in the event of a problem, and those are usually, really stressful to be in a situation and not know who to go to. So I'll just personally reinforce those from what the experiences that I've had.
Yeah, spend that time setting up for sure.
How about other people? Are there other kinds of things where people have, are there common things that you trip over or run into with your events when you're finding they're the most important things to you to get set up for success?
We know there's a lot of expertise. I can see your names and I know you. Things to add here. A comment that came in privately was about the volunteer reference form. So being sure you're bringing in those volunteers and also paying attention at checking through, doing the background check, doing the, for those long-term volunteers, being sure that there's a reference check. And there are forms and tools available, remember, on the volunteer involvement policy page. So for each of those different sections of the policy, whether it's screening or something else, there are reference forms. And if you can't find them, you can let me know. Okay. No tips, must be we covered it carefully.
Or they just have not experienced any of the challenges known to us.
That means they've done all the prep work. That's what it is. And just a little, as we talked about, that one?
Strong personalities at meetings and unequal participation.
That's a tricky, that's a common occurrence, I believe. A lot of passion coming to those meetings. People are spending their time and they want to make it valuable. They're going to have their thoughts known, and those strong personalities tend to come out and can cause some challenges. And we have some resources on that one too. Sarah and I had done the diverse personalities, I think we called it. Understanding diverse personalities, which could be strong personalities also, Flip, where we talk about kind of categorizing those strong personalities that come out and realize that there's different ways to handle different people, whether they're the bulldozer, Sarah's favorite, person who likes to take over the meeting, or maybe it's the person who's too quiet, sitting in the back of the room, not sharing opinions. So there's different ways of preparing yourself to handle those strong personalities. Actually, I think that's the slide we took out of here.
It is the slide we took out of here. But I will say that, prepping for things, and we have the forms and approaches and policies that we have are helpful in managing, when somebody, as Kim says, people are really passionate and they want to talk about their thing, but you have your process to bring them back to really appreciate what you're talking about, but we have some things that we have to all do as a group or to get through. And can try to help people stay focused.
Absolutely. So the UNI Citure is utilizing talents is a better word for that. Identifying the talents that volunteers bring to the table, whether they have a strong personality or not, challenging volunteers with growth opportunities. So making sure that if people want more opportunity, that's fantastic. And sometimes that's where the strong personalities come out. They want to have a little more involvement and they're not being challenged, and so that might be the time to if they're participating and working well with you, to elevate their position and let them take care of a certain area, maybe be a district area leader with 4-H leaders, and they can check in on other volunteers if that's a strong positive personality, that is. Also being sure you have that two-way communication and you're sharing that praise and recognition. And that annual review is very crucial for those longtime volunteers that are sticking around for a year or so, come back year after year, being sure you're checking in and you know that they're not, you know that they're representing the program well, that they're checking in on with your leader opportunities or volunteer opportunities, and also that they're feeling like they're challenged enough or not too much. So that you and Isature is a really important part of this webinar in general. Okay, now for the real fun. How are we doing with time?
I think we have 30 minutes.
All right.
Right. So you are a young 4-H youth development educator planning an award trip to the zoo for some excelling 10 to 12-year-olds. Mrs. Bailey and Mr. Roberts have agreed to chaperone with you, and in fact, Mrs. Bailey has agreed to drive the van for the extra youth who need a ride. The zoo is 110 miles away from the extension office where everyone has agreed to meet. There are 20 youth ages 10 to 12. How do you set up for success? So give us some ideas about what you would do. We lost one person. They've got a meeting too, but we will post this.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yep. So how are you going to set up for success for this trip to the zoo with 20 10 to 12-year-olds?
We'll let you put that right in the chat box. I like it.
Yeah. Thank you. Connie appreciates the MVR check.
Connie's our expert in background screening, whether it's motor vehicles or not.
Thank you for the background check. Get more volunteers. I totally agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about that, overburdened volunteers. We may be seeing some of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll take it to the next one. So that's kind of the setup there. Oh, got more coming in. That's good. And a stop.
Yeah,
a break
that's
on the
actually
way.
that's a really good, a plan, a stop, and a break on the way, really good. I really like maybe review youth development because youth are at different stages and may have different needs.
That's great. Remember, you're sending off volunteers, so let's make sure that they're familiar with all that also. Okay. So, and then we get to the event.
So you arrive at the zoo. Martha's mom brought Martha and her fellow club member Warren from the neighborhood in a separate car. They yell a greeting to you. Mrs. Bailey is a little frazzled from the drive and inexplicably begins to take all the cash from the 4-H members who are asked to bring their money for lunch to be sure it doesn't get lost. But she just starts stuffing it into her pockets. She's not recording the amounts for which child had which money, since she doesn't have a pen. And she knows she has to get back on and clean the bus and make sure all the kids are off the bus in order to go to the zoo. And she has to take them to the restroom after parking. However, if she doesn't get the money now, they might lose it. So it's really important to get the money. Of course, she's new at this and wasn't sure what to expect. What do you do right then?
Making me panic. See the wheels turning, Connie. I don't want to be Mrs. Bailey.
I know, there's something in here for everyone.
Don't sign up. Is that what you're saying as a volunteer? Get a pen. Awesome.
Take the money.
I'm also seeing, sounds like there wasn't enough volunteer support for this trip to begin with. If you're not seeing it, it's because the comments are coming in privately, which is perfectly fine. You can do that or chat. Take the money. Let's not leave a volunteer with a bunch of money and not knowing how much has been collected.
Make notes on your phone, good call.
Mm-hmm.
That would have evolved since we started doing this, right? Talk with the youth, ask how much money they gave to her before it becomes one pot. Also good.
And I think we talked about some of the setup before. As in, let's be sure we have enough volunteers to handle this. Ready to
Can they just hold on to their own money? That is one approach. How is it done? Is there sort of multiple approaches?
That's a perfectly fine option, but that's not what Mrs. Bailey decided to do. I think we had in here that she just like sort of takes that on. So was she asked to do that, and was she prepared to do that, and the whole setup? How are we going to handle the money, or was she just freaking out, thinking these kids aren't going to have lunch if I don't hold their money because they're going to go buy something else? So, yeah, yeah, but they could definitely. I think that's again that might depend a little bit on the age.
Move towards the bathroom and do the money collection outside as they rotate in and out. I'm glad you still have all the kids. Thank you.
That's awesome. All right.
Great.
And, yep, and plan ahead. Okay.
All right.
Scenario time.
So the youth are starting to complain about needing the bathroom, and as we said, some are already walking in that direction. Mr. Roberts, who's also on the trip, is nowhere to be found. And oh, wait, you see him over by the zoo entrance having a cigarette. It was a long ride, and he made a few inappropriate names for the two rowdy brothers who were sitting right behind him, and realized this is not the first time he's been swearing. He's been told not to swear or smoke. He signed the code of conduct, and yet you've got kids all over the place. You've got Mrs. Bailey with money hanging out of all of her pockets. We're not sure if the bus has been cleaned, and we know that sometimes things aren't easily controlled. And those kids are actually sort of a little bit loud. And he saw them telling you about the outburst. So the kids have come to you and complained to you about him calling them names. He's watching you while he's smoking his cigarette by the zoo entrance. Now what do you do?
And this is a made-up scenario, but it may be pieces of a few that we've had situations. So it's not any one particular association that this is on. One more time in the chat boxes. Take some time to have a little discussion or write your thoughts down.
In this scenario, there's no CCE staff member, right?
That's right.
Okay. But this is a CCE sponsored trip.
That's right, 4-H. Back on the bus, and bathroom trips with chaperone in a controlled number of youth at one time. Good suggestion. Remind him of the code of conduct and explain how all volunteers are needed at this moment. Also really good. Pull him aside and have a conversation with Mr. Roberts, or back in the car and go home. Try for another day. Assign youth to each adult and don't put two rowdy boys with Mr. Roberts. Good call.
Yeah.
Separate the boys. So can we list all the things that might be making us uncomfortable right now with these three scenarios? Code of conduct violations, finance, questionable approach to finances. What else? Lack of a plan. Thank you.
That almost summarizes it. Code of conduct infractions.
Understaffed. So we didn't really say about the
control.
Yeah, the bus. Can we assume that had a paid bus driver? So this was not so it's not a volunteer driving the bus, but we had a mom driving club members to the zoo. Anything about that? So what is
As
the,
in the setup you're talking about?
yeah, like
Mhm.
we have one, I mean, the mom is acting as a driver of another youth.
Mhm.
So in the, that becomes sort of hits the driving requirements, and this is over permission slips from the youth in the personal car. Again, the MVR check, but also
Right.
when you have a single car, and is it over 100 miles? That's
Yeah.
what's in my head. We need a second driver in case something goes wrong, although at least there's the bus. Hopefully there's room on the bus. But we have had situations where we've had people get sick and not have a second driver, and it does get challenging.
Yep, and we do have the 2 volunteers on the bus if they could fill in, assuming they were coming together, but this kind of sounded
Mhm.
like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that one mom was just showing up with some numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah. All kinds of good concerns there. Yeah. So kind of fun to think through scenarios and what could happen, and I think that's important when you're thinking about an event to think through and make sure volunteers are prepared and that you've thought through every, especially if you're not going to be on site, all the situations that might be happening. Yep. And the motor vehicle check. Yeah. All right. Thanks for working us through that. Fun, Sarah.
Just brought up some things.
So what else might empower you and your volunteers? We had a lot of solutions that came up in the chat, and that's fantastic. Is there anything you might want to add? Just take some time, think about things that might better make empower you, the educator, or even empower the volunteer. I feel like a lot of things came up as you were chatting. I can hear the discussion going on in the small groups.
We can't really hear you.
So I think the points with the let's be sure we've done everything that needs to be done as far as the checks and the background checks and the orientation to the volunteer, the pre-planning, thinking through, definitely would empower your volunteers more. And having that point person, somebody brought that up too. Who do we go to, and who's going to help take care of Mrs. Bailey and Mr. Roberts? So we're going to move along to when there are those situations, whether it's not necessarily on the spot, but there's sometimes complaints of volunteers that come up about another volunteer. Maybe it's a complaint from a volunteer about a staff member. Maybe it's a situation where a staff member sees something a volunteer did, smoking on the zoo trip, for instance, or just things that do come up that may be less serious situations. So these are actually pulled from the volunteer involvement policy. So we're on the staff site under organizational development. If you look at volunteer involvement policy, you'll see that there's these procedures that go along, and one is the informal resolution. So these are all under supervising volunteers. So for the less serious situations, we talk about the parties involved meet face-to-face. So the ideal situation, if there's a conflict with 2 volunteers, is that have them kind of work that out amongst themselves. That's not working. Let's try to bring them together and really encourage respect. Have the parties, you might have the appropriate supervisor attend, so you as the extension educator or the executive director may be involved with this. But again, we're trying to keep the situations with the smallest group possible and still resolving the situation, and then making sure you're summarizing the resolution in writing. So that's just kind of a real quick informal resolution. If the complaint relates to the equal program opportunity or other civil rights issues, you definitely want to refer to the affirmative action policy. Screen's not working the right way. So that's informal resolution. I don't know if people have anything to add to that. Sometimes that doesn't work, so we're going to click on to the next one, and there's a little more detail on the website also. Here are the clicks. So the more formal resolutions, when things start to get a little more serious. The informal resolution doesn't work any longer. We're definitely, you want to make sure we're noting everything in the files, documenting everything. When the volunteer is subject of a complaint or an informal resolution hasn't worked, you would do a written complaint to the supervisor. So depending on where it's come from, you definitely want to put this conflict in writing. The supervisor would look to gather more information. Supervisor may be the extension educator, maybe the executive director. Somebody was going to go and investigate this a little bit further, trying to get some more information. Again, we're trying to keep that challenge to a small circle as possible. And the decision would be discussed with the executive director. The appropriate action would be taken without blame. So if we need to go back to the volunteer needs to be put on what's the word I want?
Performance improvement?
Yep, or a performance improvement, or if they need to be not dismissed, but before that, I feel like I'm playing.
Probation.
Yes, that's the word. Definitely need to take that action without blame. So just saying, here's a situation, here's what we need to do for now. If there's a court case pending, we've had that also before. You just say, till we know more, we need to have you step away from the program. And then there's possibility of them coming back, of course. And then to make sure that everything is written, a written note goes to the volunteer. You want to add to that?
Well, I would ask you so the informal resolution is sort of for the less serious events. So if the educator has sort of a gut feeling that this has potential to be a big issue, or they discuss it with the executive director and it feels like that's something that might blow up or have long-term challenges, is it okay to step right to the formal process, or is that sort of going too fast?
I think it depends on the situation. Yeah, there's definitely there's nothing wrong with going to that formal resolution if that smaller group isn't working. That's a good point to make there.
And Mary's saying include your board president, and that's a super important point. Nobody wants to get blindsided at the grocery store.
That's right. Right. So anytime you can prepare, that's good. Anything? Nope. You're good. So that's a real quick, the quick steps with the informal resolution and the formal resolution. And then there are times where whatever's written, the expectations aren't followed, the volunteer doesn't come through on their end. If we say we're going to agree to this timeline or whatever performance help we want to give them, if they're not coming through, or there's a reason that we really do need to release a volunteer, and sometimes there's serious situations we need to do that right on the spot. Here's where we really show that tender care. I put hide under the bed for a while. I don't know if you agreed with that one, Sarah, or not, but there's just some times where you cringe. And then we always encourage that you talk to a trusted colleague and involve your executive director, again, your board member. They may have come in before this. But if it's here's what we have to take care of. Talk to people. Here's what I'm thinking. Am I exaggerating with this? Is this really a situation where we need to release this volunteer? Especially if it's not a long-term situation that you don't have a plan yet, but it's somebody's been charged with something. Be sure attempts to correct are complete. So did we clearly try to help this person? Are we sure this volunteer knows what they've done wrong? Have they agreed to some type of plan to get over what they were doing wrong? Being sure that whatever attempts to correct are complete. And then checking whether directors and officers insurance is up to date. I think especially our executive directors on the line might agree with that. Sometimes it does cause a very passionate reaction. Volunteer who's been a long time volunteer with Extension may just go talk to some friends if they get released from the program. So being sure that that's taken care of. And we do every association has director and officers.
They should. They should. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they find out at a really bad moment they don't. So
good to check on that before that release of the volunteer happens. And if expectations are not met, to release the volunteer with a letter. So very clear letter. We do have sample letters in the volunteer involvement policy, just a quick template that says you are released, and whatever equipment you have, or maybe it's a treasury if they happen to have some funds collected through their volunteer role, being sure that all the departure details are in those letters.
Yeah.
And then follow with written notification if there is some type of release that's done verbally.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've learned, Kim, is documentation of what's happened. And even if, educators or the volunteers being encouraged to keep notes of things that happen that make them uncomfortable, that they've addressed maybe verbally, because we've had some times where there have been some egregious things and there was actually stuff leading up to it, but there was no documentation. And it's similar to employee management, that without the documentation, it's really, the person sometimes feels like they're being targeted or bullied or not being listened to. And the more that the educator and the association can help explain through, backed up with the documentation of the concerns that they have, it oftentimes helps that volunteer understand maybe why a decision's being made. And I will say, in the time before I was here, and then so I've been here almost 10 years, but there have been at least a couple where people thought that they were being discriminated against because of their race. And in those cases, of course, as with many of these others, the documentation of the problems that had occurred was very important to be clear why the dismissal was happening, had nothing to do with the personal characteristics of the individual. So it's just really important to keep that in mind.
A great addition. And I know, again, we have lots of expertise on the line. Anything else to add to that or questions about that?
Yeah, and as Kim says, lots of expertise, and these things aren't black and white. I mean, sometimes we have conversations with educators or executive directors, like, what do you think of this? How does this seem? Because sometimes it feels not quite right, but you need to check your thinking. And you have Kim Fleming, myself, Jamie and Karen at PW Wood, we almost always pull them in immediately to just have that discussion. Your state extension specialist, because we have had some sticky issues with volunteers. And the other thing we know is that our communities are really close. As Kim said, if something happens, oftentimes the volunteer, anybody might go out and share it with their 15 or 1,500 best friends on Facebook. So all of these things, oftentimes the potential for damage can be pretty large even when it seems like something small. And we do try to be sensitive about that and how we handle it. And we certainly, as an organization, want to protect their privacy. There may be even times where they're out putting it on Facebook and we have to take the high road and say, this is an internal issue and we can't respond. So there's all sorts of challenges that we face as an organization, but the key is that you do have resources both out in your own association and in your region, but also up here on campus.
Okay, Sarah, I'm going to talk about illegal acts or endangering safety, I believe.
So Kim, Kim saved the fun ones for me. So
one of your favorite topics.
It actually is, and it's interesting because empower is not usually a word I use a lot, but this is really a place where it makes sense to me to empower our educators. And in some of the experiences that we've had with some challenging situations that happened on the spot, we sometimes saw educators and the volunteers unsure of what their authority was to step in and to stop a situation. And so there were things going on that they felt uncomfortable with, maybe the way that youth were treating each other, or the volunteers were treating each other, or the volunteers and the youth. And people just weren't sure. So my suggestion was to think about, something really simple. And between me, Kim, and Jamie Ferris, we came up with SHINE. And SHINE is when something's going on, what we want to do is stop it. You want to interrupt that. It might be youth fighting or adults fighting. We've had that, or maybe adults not understanding their role with the youth and overstepping. So stop the behavior. And they educate, it can be polite, like, excuse me, Mrs. Bishop, but I think I need you over here for just a minute. Or it can be, that's not the kind of language we use, and we need to, you know, ratchet this particular event down. And this is something we really want to, anytime we can get conflict resolution skills built or talk about potential opportunities or things that could happen, it's really important to do that. The second aspect is get help. So it might be medical help, police help. It might be another adult to manage the two rowdy boys kind of help. But we want to make sure that the youth or our participants are safe. We've had car accidents. We've had volunteers pulled over, you know, in the car with the youth driving. The key is that we want to focus on that safety. Investigate in some of the events that we've had. We do need names. We need to know who observed something, names, contact information, and it'll help us get to the bottom of an issue quickly. I can't say that I recall any particular events that we had where it was any kind of police stuff. We've had police involved, but not any criminal activity or anything like that. But we do want to be able to, you know, sort of explain the who, why, what, where, when, how, where were people standing, how did the injury occur, was there a hole in the ground, or was the fence bad or something. The next aspect of this is notify. And Mary brought this up before. There's, depending on the topic, there's going to be a lineup of people that we need to notify. You know, every educator should let their supervisor, and the supervisor or directly to the executive director. It depends on how your association handles that and the size of your association. But your ED needs to know, because they're going to get blindsided on the phone by a newspaper person, a radio reporter, all those things. You do not want your executive director blindsided. You want to let your board know. The ED will let the board know. We don't want the board blindsided. It's just super, super important to keep these people in the loop. If it looks like anything dicey, police, a major injury, a lawsuit might come out of this, parents being really upset, that's where I would escalate it to campus. And that's where you would want to let me and Kim know. Jamie Ferris, depending on the situation, will escalate it to the state extension specialist so they don't get blindsided. Chris Watkins, the director of extension, in some cases the situations have been pretty potentially serious. I've let university council know, government relations, because we do end up having situations where the press is calling, and you know, if the university is already aware of it, people who are in the loop, they can help keep it calm and provide a response that we're on top of it, as opposed to, gee, I hadn't heard that. And not that they would say that, but just we want to keep everybody in a position where they're able to act quickly. But so I think that Shine, we've done it a couple of times. Jamie and I have done it at a 4-H event, and we've done some online. It's available in our professional development site. And I think it's it's really super simple. So stop, help, investigate, and we have incident reports, so some people call it that. Notify, remember that chain. And then that last part is evaluate. How did this happen? How could we avoid it in the future? And oftentimes it goes back to, as I've said, and Kim noted, did you orient people properly? Did you know who the point person was? And did people know what their roles were? Oftentimes, if you have those things set up in advance, it goes much easier. And I will tell you from my own experience, we had an extension administration event where we were traveling as a large group, and someone became sick in the night and ended up going to the hospital. And there were 3 of us who should have had the emergency contact list. I was the one person who did not have it, so that's fun to share with you. And I was the person that did not have it, but I was the only person that answered the phone at 2 a.m. in my hotel room. The other 2 people who had it slept through the phone. And because I didn't have it, and I couldn't get a hold of the other people who had the emergency contact list, I was up in the middle of the night trying to get into the registration site to find the person's emergency contact. So there was a lesson for me about being prepared. And when I came back, part of my evaluation was making sure that the core group of people always had the contact list, because in that event, everything was fine, but minutes could count sometime, and we never want that. So I just wanted to share that personal experience. And I think Kim mentioned it also, if a volunteer is to any degree of credibility has been accused of something that makes us realize that that person needs to pause, they have rights too. Their reputation is terribly important too. So it's handled, as Kim said, with respect for the person. There have been times where we've just simply asked a person if they would step down, please, and maybe address their personal issues. So it's very quiet, and they agree and we agree that they'll step away from program for a period of time. But if they're unwilling to do that, and we've had that too, then we'll move to the more formal approach to protect the organization, the youth, and make sure that that person has time to address things that they have to take care of. Any questions about any of that? And please feel free always to reach out to me, Kim, and Jamie if you have challenging bits to deal with.
Feel free to put your questions in, but this is just as Sarah was saying, when those challenging things do happen, there is support there. So on the slides, and again, you can get the slides from the link in the email, P.W. Wood, the Wood office, Jamie Ferris, Karen Supek, or Sarah. My email is there also, and for the 4-H program, Andy Turner's another resource, and the state specialist. So that's all listed there on that page. So seek help. I think you covered that very well. Thank you. So I think then we just go back on evaluating our challenges. Those are some of those points that we talked about earlier. What's our shared interest? What's our core principles? So bringing that list back up to evaluate for success of an event. And again, Sarah covered this on the last page, is thinking about, did staff know what they were responsible for, and they have all the information they needed, where challenges addressed. Did we address challenges directly, or did some things happen that didn't get addressed while we were on the spot? And then that whole, are we keeping things relationship oriented? So I think we've covered that well also. And of course, the celebrating the success. Everybody likes to do that, and it's important. We've put a lot of time into setting up and implementing, so we definitely want to go ahead and celebrate when things do go well. So we wanted to ask you, we are at the end of our time, but we did want to ask you now, what percentage of time do you believe should go towards setting up for success? So is it up to 20%, up to 40%, up to 80%, or more than 80%? Just wondering, think about maybe what you put in there before. You can respond in the chat box if you'd like to everyone, or you can just think about if your preferences have changed or increased at all. Do you think you should, has there been an increased need for setting up for success? Or maybe not. And again, we're thinking in that ideal world. So. '20s and '40s. Yeah. It's nice that we still have people responding. That's great. It's late in the afternoon and we're getting past our time. So just want people to think about that time invested and what do we really put in when we're planning for an event. And it does take a major effort, especially when we're involving volunteers. Although they extend the work of staff, there's definitely a management component there because of the responsibility that we take on as we do that. Here's just a few of the clips from the website. So as you know, on the staff, if you go to the staff homepage under units, organizational development and accountability, you'll see a whole section of professional development, risk management, communications, and leadership. On June 20th, we have the favorite summer webinar, Risks of Summer in CCE. So Jamie Ferris will be presenting that on June 20th at 11 a.m. Go to the staff page and you can click right there to register. I think many of you are registered, quite a few registered for all three, the whole series. Or encourage somebody else to attend who maybe hasn't seen that before. So those are just some of the areas I think that all connect to working with volunteers and working with them successfully. And I think that's it. So that will conclude the presentation. Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate you taking time from thinking about all the other things in your world.
You too.
And you too, Connie. Thanks for being here. And we definitely appreciate everybody signing on today and fitting this in. Appreciate that. We're going to be watching the chat for a little bit. So if you've got something, okay, we'll be looking for that volunteer reference form. I'll double check that on the website. Make sure you get that. Mm-hmm. And then Katie's sharing, dealing with differing personalities, most frequent issue I face. That's great. That's something that we could definitely arrange, Katie, to make happen, or I can share some of those resources. The course page there. I'll send you the link, Katie Oaks.
Thank you, everybody.
Actually,
Thank you
send
for
that
the
to
work
full
that
group.
you do.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Have a great summer. Heading into the camps
I know.
and fairs and